Rock formation is actually a term that was coined by my academic advisor, Larry Grossberg, who was known for a long time as the professor of rock and roll. And Larry used the phrase rock formation to describe the way in which rock culture was the central organizing principle for youth culture and what we might call sort of alternative culture in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that there were lots of ways to be outside the mainstream and lots of ways to define yourself as a member of a certain generation against the other generation, but all those ways had to do with where you identified yourself on the rock map for about 30 years there. You know, it depended on what band were you most invested in, said a lot about who you were and what your values were and what sorts of friends that you had and what sorts of activities you liked to do. You know, were you a deadhead or were you a headbanger? You know, that's what you needed to know about somebody in my high school. You know, you were one or the other, and then everybody knew who you were. You know, that kind of thing is really demonstrated well in the book and the movie High Fidelity. You guys know that movie about these young people who are just so heavily invested in their musical taste, and the taste then dictate all kinds of things. Anyway, that's what we're looking for there in rock formation. The ways digital communication technologies are challenging and changing the organization of the sound recording industry. Your textbook covers that really well. If I've got some time toward the end of class today, I'll talk about that sort of thing. Major milestones in the history of radio. I think you could just go through that in the book, the timeline, that sort of thing is what we're looking for there. The role of government regulations in the development of radio, including First Amendment issues and antitrust and consolidation issues. I'm going to talk about that in the next little bit here. Economics of broadcast radio, that's in your book pretty well, but I'll talk about that a little bit, hopefully today too. And also current issues facing radio as a democratic medium of mass communication in your book, and I'll see if I'm talking about that a little bit today also. Okay, so before I get started, any basic questions, any business type questions, anything like that? Okay, you're all good to come to class on Tuesday having, or excuse me, thank you, Wednesday having studied those last two chapters and your lecture notes and watching this if you can. And who knows, maybe we'll get this next one up on LinkedIn there too, but apparently it takes 2 hours.
So did you grade the blog thing or whatever?
No, but it's moving in that direction. But no, not yet. Although Josh has looked at a few of them. Yes, in the back. What's your name?
Terry.
Terry.
I'm not going to tell you next time.
Oh, please don't do that to me.
Are you going to let us know that you've received them, or have you received everybody's links?
They're all waiting for me in my inbox. So, will I let... You'll know if you receive them because they're going to get posted on our class blog, and so if you don't see it, let me know. Okay. But they're not up yet. So. Okay. Yeah.
I'm worried about that.
Stay on that. It's good to be personally responsible for that. All right, so let's start talking a little bit about radio. As with all media, a medium of communication isn't born fully formed. You know, the radio that we know isn't the radio that was instantly created when the technology of radio became created. That was the result of a historical interaction of a number of forces, some of which were technological, some of which were economic, some of which were political, some of which were cultural, right? When the radio technology at first was created, its first application was for ship-to-shore communication, and it was particularly of interest to the Navy, and sort of hobbyists, you know, the sorts of people that, you know, today would get into computer hacking and that sort of thing, would have gotten into like ham radio operation in the very early 1900s. Famously, the first publicly known use of radio was the distress call from the Titanic, right? And significantly, there were two ships in the area when the Titanic went down, and the one that was closest to the Titanic didn't have a radio, didn't know. But the one that was further away did have a radio and wound up going to hell. Was it the Lusitania? No, that was
Carpathia?
The Carpathia, because you saw the movie, right?
Or I'm just really
What was
smart.
the Lusitania?
This guy's a history buff.
That was the one that blew up.
That was.
That's what started World War I.
So that like something
It was which one? Luckily, this isn't a history class. And you know, for a while there, this is folklore, and I think that this is true, that these radio hobbyists used to like to mess around with the Navy, and like someone would go, some ham radio guy would go on the radio and pretend he was an admiral and start ordering the fleet around. And when World War I broke out, the U.S. government sort of clamped down on all radio operators in the U.S. and said, oh, the whole radio spectrum belongs to the military. And after the First World War was over, the military and the Navy wanted to keep 100% of the radio spectrum. And there was a sort of back and forth lobbying effort between the military, and I believe it was RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, and GE. They wanted to start selling radios, and they needed to have some bandwidth opened up for public use, and the government, you know, the government was faced with a bit of a challenge, a unique challenge with regard to the radio and First Amendment rights. There's an old saying in publishing that says that freedom of the press is for anyone who can afford a press, right? And the idea is that, hey, if you can afford a printing press, print up whatever you want. If somebody wants to read your newspaper, they're welcome to read it. And of course, the radio is also a form of mass communication technology. It's protected under First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, rights is guaranteed in the First Amendment, but it presents an odd sort of technological challenge with regard to that, and you can see it in this idea of freedom of the press is for anyone who can afford a printing press. Because you know, you could have one printing press in a town, 100 printing presses in a town, 1,000 printing presses in a town, doesn't matter, because they won't knock each other out, they won't interfere with each other, but you can't do that with a radio transmission, right? You can't just have everybody throwing up a radio tower and saying freedom of the airwaves is for anyone who can afford a radio transmitter, because all the signals would cut into each other and interfere and bleed over into each other, and so it's not feasible to just let anybody have a radio license. So how are you going to do it? How are you going to decide who gets to have a radio license or not? And you know, it's understand that it's a radio license to have basically exclusive use of a certain bandwidth in a certain geographic area using something that's the airwaves, something that we would consider public property in the way that we think of air as public property and water as public property. I mean, who owns the airwaves? Well, I'd say we all own the airwaves, but we can't all have equal access to it, right? So the U.S. government wound up creating this system regulated through what's come to be the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. Originally it was the FRC, the Federal Radio Commission. And the Federal Radio Commission issued licenses to organizations that would apply for a broadcast license in a certain area, in a certain region. You know, originally there were certain limitations set up. You know, you couldn't have the license, you couldn't have too many licenses in one area. In other words, you couldn't have one entity that would dominate the radio waves in a certain area. You couldn't have a radio license and also control lots of other aspects of public information like radio. You couldn't have radio and TV and newspapers all in one town and just be one entity. There were certain limitations. But mostly what would happen is that a network would get granted a license by the FCC to have exclusive use of a certain slice of the public airwaves in exchange for a commitment to operating in the public interest. That was the big thing. To get this exclusive use of the public airwaves in exchange for operating in the public interest. And I'm going to point out that this exclusive use of the public airwaves is quite a valuable little thing to have, because the broadcasters would make a lot of money off this. And if you've got the exclusive use and there's only so much competition, and you're going to be able to, by definition, reach a mass audience, that's a very lucrative contract to have. And how much do the have and do the networks continue to pay for this exclusive use of the public airwaves? I want to venture a guess. I mean, they make a lot of money. I mean, I'm talking about, you know, the companies that got those licenses coming up on almost 100 years ago now, 80 years ago. You've heard of them. Their names are CBS and NBC. You know, very lucrative companies making a lot of money. What do you suppose they pay? Who want to guess?
Do they?
They already paid it?
They never paid it. They never paid anything. It's just given to them. We just give it to them in a kind of reverse socialism. where we take the corporations and give them this incredibly valuable thing. But of course they operate in the public interest. Right? That's the engine. They operate. I know, it's like a joke, isn't it? Historically, the way that they fulfilled their end of the bargain by operating in the public interest is by having news programs, right? With the idea that news programs are fair and balanced, right? And that they provide this essential service to the democratic body. And also that they do public service announcements, right? Which you guys have seen. When I was in high school, I mean, public service announcements were so notorious because they were all on at 2 o'clock in the morning, and they were the famous, "This is your brain," and it was a frying pan, and then it was, "This is your brain on drugs," and somebody just like put an egg into a frying pan and fried it. We all just thought that was so hysterical while we were tripping on acid.
So it worked then.
So it worked great. And then they also had the practice of providing quality children's entertainment, right? Educational programming, excuse me, I should have said so. News, public service announcements, and educational programming are the ways in which the networks have fulfilled their obligation to serving the public interest and thus getting this incredibly valuable thing. And I would suggest to you that they've done a terrible job of fulfilling those obligations, and your government has done a terrible job of enforcing its own rules. I think we should yank those licenses, give them to somebody else. Let them provide some. I mean, where do you go for education? Is that a joke? Educational programming on broadcast television? It's only on PBS, right? Non-commercial. Anyway.
That people have to, what is it, pledge money to anyway, so it's paid for by the people. It's not even connected to those licenses anyway, so they're not even have anything to do with that, you know what I mean?
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, of course, the PBS gets its own, does get a slice of the network, and thus our license. And they get a little bit of government support now, but not nearly as much as they used to. And when I say PBS, I mean both television and radio, because it's the, I guess I should say, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting funds PBS on TV and NPR on radio. Perennially under attack by the right-wing Republicans. It's supposedly different guys. Which is why Bert and Ernie no longer share a house. Because Jimmy Swaggart thought they were gay or something. Oh, we live in a crazy world. But the main thing that I want you to know about this is that it was the Radio Act of 1927 that established these rules about licensing, that the radio networks and later the television networks get their license based on the promise to operate in the public interest. Historically, they've operated in the public interest through news, programming, public service announcements, and educational programming. Obviously, the FCC hasn't done a very strong job of enforcing those rules. It's clear it's one of these things where, the owners of the media don't want you to see that part. And so I'm not saying it's a direct conspiracy, but through 1,000 indirect routes, you just don't get a lot of coverage of FCC issues in mainstream news, and it's not really surprising. They used to have something called the Fairness Doctrine, where because something was broadcast on the public airwaves, if it had a strong political position on one side of an issue, they would have to give equal time for its opposite, and for somebody advocating for its opposite position. I remember being a kid watching that. The television news shows would have editorials, and the next day they'd have somebody giving a counter editorial. And they stopped doing that under Reagan with the argument that, well, there was just so much media and so many perspectives, and there's no sense letting the government be involved in policing it. People should be able to say what they want to say with their private networks, and that was also along the time, once they did away with the Fairness Doctrine, that was when conservative talk radio really exploded during the 1980s, and we had these very extreme kind of political personalities like Rush Limbaugh coming out, and because he was, those networks were constrained by the Fairness Doctrine, you can get these very sort of one-sided political analyses coming down and giving people funny impressions about the realities of politics today, which became very influential right-wing talk radio. It was so ironic because the right-wing political pundits so dominated radio, and at the same time, all that they were doing, or half of what they did, was talk about the left-wing liberal bias. Okay, so what else have I got to say about radio?
So timeline, we're in 1927?
Well, so yeah, the Radio Act was the 20s, right? And then the 20s would have been what they called, well, the 20s, 30s, and 40s would have been the golden age of radio. Thanks for moving me forward on that. Back when radio was the only broadcast medium, the most popular electronic medium, when we think about that time, it might be hard for you to relate to it now, but there was a period between the printing press and the television, and it was the golden age of radio, and radio was the first really popular medium. even during the Depression, people could afford a radio, you know what I mean? You bought one once and it was just like nonstop entertainment. And it was, I think I mentioned this in the last class period, people talked about the radio days as being a sort of very unifying experience for Americans, because oftentimes they were listening to the same broadcast at the same time. There wasn't a lot of different things going on, and so everyone was often hearing the same thing. You know, when FDR would come give those fireside chats on the radio, a huge percentage of the American population would hear it, because there was nothing else on. And, you know, so they'd listen to it. And so the radio is described sometimes as this force of national unity. And of course, in the last class period, I talked about how the radio has been a force in race relations and exposing especially white folks to black music and having that sort of lived kind of cognitive dissonance of the ideas of white supremacy bumping up against music that was just so pleasurable and good that it became sort of anti-racist force, even though racism played itself out very much in the music industry. And then I should point out too how there's been this kind of interesting history of antagonism and then support between the industry of the recorded sound and radio. Because, like, you know, at first when records came out, by the way, there was a tension between the recording industry and the sheet music industry, because the people who owned the copyright of the sheet music were afraid that, well, if people were buying the records, then they wouldn't want to buy the sheet music, and it was unfair competition, and they had a copyright on it. You know, so they tried to prevent people from being able to record and sell copyrighted music in that way. Yeah, Corey.
That actually seems kind of backwards to me. It seems like if you have the record and you're listening to it, like, you would want to learn to play that if you played an instrument, so then therefore the sale of sheet music. Right,
which is exactly what wound up happening. And then, because it turned out that no, if the record would sell, then more people would be likely to buy sheet music. But then a similar thing replayed itself with recorded music in the radio. When the radio first came out, the recording industry was like, well, don't play our records on the radio, because then people won't want to buy the records. But of course, the opposite turned out to be true. It was that the playing the records on the radio was just like a great commercial for your records, and people would discover music on the radio and then turn around and buy the records.
Yeah. It's kind of similar to what's going on with YouTube right now with copyrights of songs. Like, they won't let songs on YouTube because they think that people won't buy the songs that's on YouTube, but in reality, like, if I hear the song on YouTube, I might want to go buy it on iTunes. So
it's exactly that kind of parallel. It's things that seem threatening at first. You know, I've got a nice video if there's time. Actually, I can show it to you at the end of the class. It's a little bit the evolution of the music industry. I'll get to it in a second. Let me. So the record folks found out that actually radio was good. Just to sort of get this set up, radio was good advertising for records. And then another interesting thing happened about 30 years later in the 1950s, again with the relationship between radio and records, where first, in a way, the radio industry saved the record industry, or at least they helped it a lot. 30 years later, in the 50s, the recorded music industry would come to save radio. And this is what happened. After the Second World War, the technology for television was rolled out. And basically, the radio industry became the television industry. And at first, it looked like television was actually just going to kill radio, because what was a radio except a television without a picture? And why would you want that when you can have a television with a picture? Besides, all the networks, all the radio networks, which at that point in the 50s, it was ABC, CBS, and NBC were the three national radio networks. They just moved en masse onto television. And they took all the shows, all the writers, all the directors, the producers, the actors and actresses, and the radio shows became television shows. The radio news shows became television news shows. The radio situation comedies became TV situation comedies. The radio soap operas became television soap operas, and indeed, like every genre that you're familiar with in television was pretty much invented first on radio, and then just sort of moved wholesale. It looked like radio was just going to die completely as a medium. And then a couple of things, well, several things intersected to save radio. And the things that intersected were, number one, we had the invention of the transistor and the transistor radio, so radio shrunk. They went into places where the television couldn't go, most especially the car. And then also in the 1950s, when you had television rolling out, you had this new phenomenon happen that was called the baby boom generation, right? The baby boom generation was this surge in babies in the United States right after the Second World War. It was like this wave of high fertility. And it corresponded with what was at that time the largest economic expansion that any country had ever seen in the modern world. You know, when the United States came out of the Second World War, you know, basically a giant global economic hegemon, right? It was like the leading industrial power after the Second World War. And that group of children known as the baby boom generation, sometimes they're referred to as the luckiest generation. And they were called the luckiest generation because it was perceived that never in history had there been this group of young people born into such fortunate conditions of affluence and security. Never before had there been a group of young people born with such an optimistic future, with such excellent educational and health prospects, with such great future employment prospects. There was the sense that we were finally beginning to reap the advantages of the scientific revolution, and it was almost as if history was over and everything was going to look like Walt Disneyland and happy and wonderful, you know. And two things happened with that generation. Number one is they were the luckiest generation. And when that generation hit their adolescent years, their teenage years, oh man, there had never been, first of all, there had never been a teenager before. I mean, obviously there were people who were in their teens, but that category of human being as being somewhere between childhood and adulthood didn't really exist in the sort of public imagination before the 1950s. But in the 1950s, they emerged in mass, this large group of people in their teens that had certain characteristics that no group ever had before at their age group. And what they had was leisure time and disposable income, right? Because they had jobs and money to spend. They weren't depression babies, they weren't down on the farm pre-electronic age kids. You know, they were going to school and having part-time jobs and driving around in cars, going shopping, buying things. And they got discovered in the 1950s when they were kids. First by these marketers who created things like the Walt Disney Mouseketeers in Disneyland, and they started realizing that if they advertised things to these young people, they'd make a lot of money because these young people could buy things, right? And so you had a lot of cultural energy going into this group. The marketers discovered them and just followed them, and they continue to follow them today. Wherever, sometimes the baby boom is referred to in this metaphor of a pig and a snake. You ever heard this metaphor? it's kind of gross. It refers to this idea that these giant, like, what do you call them, these giant Burmese pythons or Amazonian anacondas, these really, really big snakes that they get, are so big, some of them, that they'll actually eat a pig. And when a snake eats something, you know, it like disconnects its jaws and it swallows the thing whole. And so when a giant anaconda eats a pig, what you'll see is like a big fat snake, and then at some point in the snake there's a big lump, and the big lump is where the pig is. And there's this idea that wherever the baby boom generation is, whatever age the baby boom generation is, that's where all the cultural and economic energy of the country is going. You know, so right now the baby boom generation is in its 50s and 60s, and they're still drawing a lot of our energy. But anyway, back in the 1950s, when they were just starting to hit their teenage years, right, they were coveted by the marketers. Now, another thing that I'll tell you about that baby boom generation, that was sometimes called the luckiest generation, this idea that never before in American history had there been a generation born into such fortunate circumstances by parents, by the way, whose life experience had been the Depression, followed by the Second World War. So horrible times, followed by catastrophically terrible times. You know what I mean? I mean, it just sucked for them, right? And the 1950s, something happened that people started to refer to as the generation gap. And there was this sense that there was a disconnect between the two generations starting to emerge, that there was something wrong with the luckiest generation, that somehow they weren't respectful enough, they weren't grateful enough. And the luckiest generation was meanwhile looking at their adult generation thinking there's something ringing hollow about you. Because this story that you're telling me about America isn't exactly my experience of it. Because I know for a fact that that black family up the street, whose music, by the way, I happen to like quite a bit, are really discriminated against in this town. And I've noticed that Martin Luther King Jr. is having this march over there, and they seem to be upset about something. By the way, there's this women's organization over there, and they're holding marches in the street, and they're upset about something. And you know, I think I'm going to go to the movies and watch James Dean, the rebel without a cause, who is somehow really mad at his parents. And everywhere he looks at the parent generation, all he sees is hypocrisy and falsehoods, right? And then there was this perceived rise in juvenile delinquency, right? This sense that the kids were getting out of control and drag racing and committing crimes, and what's wrong with the younger generation. What they found was wrong with the younger generation was the comic books they read, the movies they were watching, and that darn rock and roll jungle music that they listened to. Because that was what was happening, you know. So basically radio programming went into television, and radio was like this abandoned city where everybody left and all the businesses closed up shop, but the architecture was still there. And into that abandoned city came basically the teenagers with their cars and these very independent local disc jockeys who suddenly had free reign in the radio stations because they had just lost all their content. And the program managers were like, well, we're going out of business in 12 months anyway, do whatever you want to do. And these disc jockeys, most notably this guy, this nice Jewish guy from Ohio named Alan Freed, started playing this new type of music that they were hearing that was being popularized by the African Americans, right? This rock and roll music. And the white teenagers driving around in cars were listening to these disc jockeys who were given this newly found freedom and who were playing this rock and roll music that they like, and it just boomed, it just caught on. And at that moment then, people started, young kids started tuning into these rock and roll stations to discover this new type of music. And the recording industry basically saved radio, right? And they also, this was the time that they invented FM radio that had a shorter distance, but it had better sound quality, so that the music sounded better. You had young people driving around in cars with leisure time and disposable income listening to rock and roll music, and then those stations were getting supported by advertisers because they knew if they advertised their movies and their clothes and their fast food on to those teenagers, they'd have the disposable income to buy it, right? And that's sort of the story of the intersection of rock and roll and youth culture in the 1950s. And then it just took on in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And radio became the home of rock music, and it was the place where you'd go. You know, when I was a kid, I was just like today. You know, there's 5 or 6 stations in Chicago, and I hear all the new music on it. WXRT, WFLD. I used to listen to Steve Dahl. You guys probably don't know who Steve Dahl is, but he was an early Chicago shock jock, you would call him now. He started this Disco Sucks campaign, and he had this big thing, and whoever were the managers over at Comiskey Park in Chicago let Steve Dahl come during a doubleheader, and they had Disco Demolition Day, and anybody who brought a disco record was allowed to come in for free as long as they gave him the record, and then Steve Dahl piled them all in the center of the field between the 2 games and blew them up. And then there was a riot, and they had to cancel the second game. And then Steve Dahl became famous. Oh, it was like 1978. I was 14 years old. That was the coolest thing I'd ever heard of. And then, so you've got, and then in the 1990s, everything starts going digital, and you get Napster coming on. And Napster has this peer-to-peer file sharing software where, you know, digital technologies made it so easy to copy music. And then suddenly it seemed like the recording industry was in a lot of trouble because people were stealing their music rather than buying the music. But it turns out that the recording industry still makes plenty of money. And it's because even though lots of people are stealing so much music, there's just more music being generated and shared now. And I'm going to show you guys a video because I have enough time. The video is going to illustrate this better than I can. But it's basically that profits are just going up and up because the appetite for music is so huge that even if a lot of people are stealing it, more and more people are buying it all the time. You know, you kind of can't believe the recording industry when they tell you that this is how much money pirated music is costing us, because they assume that they would actually make a sale for every song that someone stole. But mostly that's not what it is. You wouldn't just automatically buy it. And you know, of course, what wound up happening is iTunes came along and kind of hybridized it and made it so, okay, you could download it, and you could download it 1 song at a time, but do it for 99 cents.